Hello, and welcome to this session. My name is Maksims Kravcenko, but you can just call me Max. And today, we'll be talking about AI as a guide, not as a replacement. Nowadays, in 2026, artificial intelligence is rapidly integrating into online learning platforms as we speak, whether it's through generative writing tools or adaptive platforms, tutoring systems. AI is no longer hypothetical, but rather it is infrastructural. So this also brings a lot of concerns. Will it replace writing? Will it replace the instructors? Or will it even replace thinking? I want to reframe that because the more productive question isn't if AI is going to replace education, but rather if it's whether we design AI to help us or replace us. So without further ado, let's deep dive into it. So in this case, AI's impact on education didn't suddenly explode in 2025 and 2026. The surge was clearly visible in 2023 because in that year, UNESCO already published its guidance on generative AI in education and research, and the framing was clear. AI in education was no longer hypothetical, and that education should be human-centered. To be specific, UNESCO emphasized three things that matter for this session. So first, human agency must be preserved. AI should expand decision making and learning, not replace it. Additionally, pedagogical intent must drive adoption. So, in other words, we shouldn't say, hey, where can I plug it in? But more so, what could actually help students learn? You know? And lastly, UNESCO warns that the equity and ethical risks of AI also pose a threat because poorly implemented AI needs to be addressed. So, for example, like over-reliance, misinformation, or more common AI term, hallucinations. Additionally, the EDUCAUSE Horizon report makes a similar point from a more institutional perspective. First and foremost, it's being very clear, and it identifies generative AI as one of the defining forces shaping digital learning and higher education. And it also argues that institutions need to move from more reactive responses to more so intentional integration because AI is going to remain here whether we like it or not. So we either adapt from it or it beats us to it. So what both reports share is a simple but powerful idea. In this case, is design decisions determine educational outcomes. And that matters even more in learning because online environments already have challenges like isolation, delayed feedback, higher self-regulation demands, and also reduced informal support. So when AI enters that environment, it doesn't operate in like a vacuum. It can either compensate for these challenges or rather, the worst outcome, amplify them. So the core question is, are we designing AI to replace cognitive effort or to guide it, amplify, structure, and support it? So let's start with replacement-oriented AI. So replacement-oriented AI, it's kind of like that AI that gives you a straight answer, removes any friction, optimizes speed over outcome, and basically goes straight from point A to point B with no detours. Does that remind you of something? I'll let you think about that one. So initially, it feels great, right? Because that's exactly what we asked for. We want a solid answer given a question. But that's the problem. We lose a lot of learning because said learning occurs often in those detours. So, for example, learning science supports this. In this case, the cognitive load theory, which was associated with John Swiller, reminds us that effortful cognitive processing is part of how learners build durable understanding. It's what sometimes we describe as mental models or schemas, right? So, for example, let's give a very basic definition. If we teach a young child that 5 minus 3 equals 2 without any reasonable explanation, they'll just regurgitate what they've heard, right? You just don't hand them 2. You guide them through the reasoning so that the concept actually sticks. So, for example, Johnny has 5 apples, and Johnny gives Timmy 3 apples. How many apples do you have? And they make that mental process of what is happening to achieve said result. So, pivoting back to the more AI-centered conversation, when AI generates that finished solution, it can reduce frustration in the moment, right? Because we see everything happening, but it can also bypass the reasoning process that builds long-term understanding. So, replacement-oriented AI can produce a pattern where students look productive, but learn less deeply. And in other words, short-term performance can come at the cost of long-term understanding. So now let's talk about the guidance-oriented AI. So guidance-oriented AI, it's the type of guidance-based systems that ask to clarify something, ask reflective questions. They provide layer hints. They make reasoning visible. And gradually, they somewhat make you detached from them throughout time. And there's an example of that in my own context. So right now, I'm an employee at AT&T. I'm a software engineer, and we have this tool. It's called SkillUp, which is part of HackerRank. And given a coding question, if I see myself stuck, I have this AI tutor that I ask questions. I'm like, hey, this is what I was thinking. What do you think? And it tells you, hey, that's a great approach. Or, let's read more of the question because it's asking this and this and that. How would you format it so that this would get it? So rather than giving you direct answers, it's prodding for your understanding. And when there's something that you genuinely don't understand, it introduces that concept and makes you understand how it works. So, this approach aligns with foundational learning theory. So, for example, Vygotsky's zone of proximal development suggests that learning happens when support is provided, sure, but within reach. So, like, not when the task is removed, but rather when learners are guided through that what they can do with assistance. Kind of like similarly with training wheels, right? When we're trying to ride that bike, initially I'll get that push with the training wheels and we pedal and we progressively learn to remove those wheels. That's what guidance-based AI should look like. And that's essentially what scaffolding is. It's to support, it's like that kind of support that helps you do what you couldn't do alone and then fades as you become more capable. So, guidance-oriented AI doesn't eliminate effort, it structures effort. And that distinction is the key idea of this session. So now let's apply this to the student experience in online learning. Let's slow down and ground it in something real, the student experience. Because before we talk about AI design principles, we have to understand the environment students are already navigating. So researcher and student experience, including Tito's work, show that students remain engaged when they experience 3 things: competence, clarity, and connection. Similarly, the community of inquiry framework emphasizes cognitive presence. In other words, the ability for learners to construct meaning through sustained reflection and dialogue. But online environments complicate this. So, comparison to peers becomes invisible but constant. Imposter phenomenon, especially in fields like computer science, becomes amplified. Feedback loops are slower, and self-regulation demands are higher. So now, imagine a student who is already unsure whether they belong. They turn to AI. If AI instantly generates a perfect answer, the message, even unintentionally, becomes, I couldn't have done this myself. But what if AI, instead of bringing that sensation, what if it asks, what have you tried? What concept applies here? Let's break this into parts. So the message becomes, you're capable, let's work on this together. And that difference is not just cosmetic. Walton and Cohen's belonging research shows that small psychological signals can significantly influence persistence. AI systems send signals. So the real question is, what signal are we sending? So now let's connect that to retention. Research on online persistence, including Richardson and Broadband, consistently show us that self-regulation and feedback quality are strong predictors of success. Students just don't need answers directly. They need structured feedback. They need clarity about what to do next. They need support that strengthens their capacity, not replaces it. So as we mentioned before, guidance-oriented AI can provide immediate feedback in asynchronous environments, reduce the feeling of isolation, clarify next steps, and encourage reflection. Whereas replacement-oriented AI encourages surface level completion, reduces productive struggle, and undermines the metacognitive development. And here's the key. The issue is not AI. The issue is whether the systems strengthen cognitive presence or bypasses it. That's the dividing line. And now we'll talk about the three principles that us as educators should focus on to create the AI that the students need. So now let's talk about the first design principle, which is scaffolding, not solving. Research on intelligent tutoring systems, including Van Len's meta-analysis, shows us that adaptive hint systems can produce learning gains comparable to human tutoring. Alevin and colleagues demonstrate that layered hints often outperform immediate solutions. Just like we made that example way back then with the simple mathematics question. That type of understanding expands comprehension and understanding of what is being instructed. And that tells us something important. Students learn more when they are guided through reasoning than when they are handed answers. So, in practice, scaffolding should look like offering hints before full solutions, because sometimes, there can be a moment where they actually need the full solution to gauge that initial understanding. Encouraging a first attempt, breaking complex tasks into components. Sometimes it can be so big for someone that they just overwhelm themselves and they think they can do it and resort to AI. So sometimes backtracking and just starting off by a small bunch, then another small bunch, and then bigger and bigger and bigger is the better approach. And asking clarifying questions before generating output. So even with Gen AI tools, the difference might simply be prompt design. So instead of write this essay for me, we might design outline an argument structure, identify weaknesses, suggest improvements. Nowadays, we can ask AI to have a context window in which they operate upon. So if we design an AI that is able to act as is, and that already exists, as you may recall from that corporate example, then we can teach the students accordingly. And that is the main bullet point. One removes effort, and the other one structures it. And that distinction is everything. So now let's move on to the second principle, transparency. So the second design principle for our tool is transparency. Explainable AI research, including Ribeiro's work, shows that users trust systems more when reasoning is visible. Remember, for example, when you had an exam and you didn't understand why it was wrong, and instead they explained to you why this is the correct approach or why the solution that you presented is not correct compared to what was supposed to be. It broadens your understanding furthermore, right? And in education, this matters even more because visible reasoning supports metacognition. Long and McGarrico's AI literacy framework emphasizes that students must understand how AI systems generate outputs if they are to use them responsibly. So, in an online learning environment, transparency might mean showing why a suggestion was made, highlighting uncertainty, and explaining trade-offs in responses because sometimes, answer A and answer B might be the same, but which one is better for this context, right? So opaque systems produce polished outputs. However, transparent ones build thinking. And if we want AI to guide learning rather than replace it, reasoning must be visible. And now, last but not least, we'll talk about the third design principle, which is progressive autonomy. Or in other words, cognitive apprenticeship theory from Collins, Brown, and Newman emphasizes modeling, coaching, and then fading support. Does that remind you of something? I kind of talked about it earlier. And that is, in other words, like the metaphor with the training wheels. So when we're learning something new, we feel safer with the training wheels. But as we grow more and more accustomed to the motion, the training wheels should slowly disappear without us even realizing it. And that also is reflected on Zimmerman's work on self-regulated learning, where it shows that students benefit from structured guidance that gradually transitions it into independence. So that means support should not remain constant, but rather early in a course, in a more structured scaffolding, may be appropriate. But mid-course, it should be more towards reflection. And then towards the end of the course, it should be more so critique rather than generation. So you see kind of like what's happening. We're going from initial step by steps, baby steps. Then we're strengthening the understanding, and then we're cementing it by applying a critique perspective from what the student knows and comparing it side by side, saying, do they really get the concept? And that should be more towards the end of the course. So AI should not create permanent dependency, but rather it should build capacity. And then if support never fades, how are we supposed to grow autonomy? So hence why this third principle is based on that we want progressive autonomy. So how do we apply all of this? Before we even have to design our own thing, maybe we want to resort to something that already exists, which is a more comprehensive and easier way, of course. But before we do that, we need to understand a few things. First, does it encourage thinking before answering? Does it make reasoning visible? Does it increase or decrease student agency? Does it support fade over time? Does it reinforce confidence or dependency? Those are the questions you should be asking when looking into AI education tools or something like that. Because if most answers lean towards automation without engagement, then the system trends toward replacement. And otherwise, if it's vice versa, if it's an actual tool that eventually degrades or disappears over time, then that is something you should encourage in your educational curriculum. Artificial intelligence in online education is not inherently transformative. It is immensely design dependent. If we design AI for speed and output, we're replacing thinking. If we design AI for scaffold thinking, prompting, reasoning, and slowly guiding the student into an independent state, then we strengthen persistence and confidence. The future of online teaching is not replaced, it's not automated, it is augmented. So the real question is not what can AI do for my students? It's more so how can AI help students do more for themselves? And with that, I thank you for your time and you have an amazing rest of the day.